The kind of tired Marcus Hale carried wasn't the kind that sleep fixed anymore. It used to be. There was a time not so many years ago when he could come home from a 12-hour shift at the shop, shower the grease off his forearms, and fall into bed next to Carol and wake up feeling like himself again. That version of tired had a cure. This version didn't. This version had settled into his bones somewhere around the 14-month mark after the funeral, and it had stayed there the way cold stays in an old house. Not dramatic, not unbearable, just present. Always present. He was 43 years old. He had a 9-year-old daughter named Lily who liked strawberry Pop-Tarts and had recently decided that the color orange was her entire personality. He had a 2-bedroom rental on Keswick Avenue in Pittsburgh that smelled faintly of motor oil, no matter how many times he mopped the kitchen floor. He had 16 years of experience as a diesel mechanic and a certification from the Allegheny County Vocational Institute that he kept in a manila folder in the 3rd drawer of his filing cabinet because no one had ever asked to see it. What he did not have was a college degree. This fact had never particularly bothered him until it started costing him things. The Tuesday evening in question began the way most of his Tuesdays began, with Lily at her grandmother's for the night and Marcus with 4 hours to fill before he could justify going to sleep. He had tried television. He had tried the woodworking project gathering dust in the garage. He had ended up in a booth at Callahan's Bar and Grill on Penn Avenue because the alternative was sitting in his kitchen listening to the refrigerator hum and thinking about the letter he'd received that morning from Kellerton Industrial Services. It was the 3rd rejection in 8 months. The position had been a senior fleet maintenance supervisor role. The kind of job he could do in his sleep, the kind of job he'd effectively been doing unofficially at his current shop for 4 years while drawing a junior technician's pay. The rejection email had been polite. It had thanked him for his time. In the 4th line, almost as an apology, it had mentioned that the selected candidate held a bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering. Marcus had read that line 3 times, folded his phone face down on the kitchen counter, and made himself a sandwich he didn't eat. So now he was in a booth at Callahan's, nursing a youngling he'd ordered mostly for something to hold, watching the 9 o'clock crowd filter in through the front door. He wasn't looking for anything. He wasn't expecting anything. He was just a man taking up a small amount of space in a dim room, trying to feel less like a wall someone kept walking into. He noticed the couple 2 booths over, not because he was paying attention, but because it was difficult not to. The man was speaking in a low, continuous stream. The kind of voice that never quite rises to a level others can clearly hear but lands with full weight on the person it's aimed at. Marcus couldn't make out the words. He could make out the tone, which was the particular tone of someone who has decided, early in an evening, that the other person in the conversation does not get to have one. The woman across from him was sitting very still. Marcus knew that stillness. He'd seen it on Carol once, at a Christmas party years ago, when her then-boss had cornered her near the appetizer table and talked at her for 30 minutes. It was the stillness of someone calculating the least costly way to end a situation. Not afraid, exactly, just doing math. She was somewhere in her late 30s, dark-haired, wearing a blazer over a gray blouse. She had the look of someone who had come from work and hadn't had time to decide whether she wanted to be here. There was a glass of wine in front of her that she hadn't touched in at least 20 minutes. Marcus had been watching without meaning to, and he was almost certain she hadn't touched it once since he sat down. The man reached across the table and picked up her phone. It was a small gesture. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. He glanced at the screen and set it back down, but the way she went even stiller told Marcus everything. He flagged down the server, a young guy named Devin whose name tag he'd memorized over months of Tuesdays. "Can you do something for me?" Marcus said. "Tell the woman in that booth that her ride is here." Devin looked over, looked back, and without any further discussion, walked across the room. Marcus stood up. He wasn't doing it to be a hero. He wasn't doing it because he'd planned it. He did it because the alternative was sitting there watching, and sitting there watching was something he could not make himself do. He crossed the room the way he crossed a shop floor when something needed fixing. Not hurrying, not making a production of it, just moving with the specific intention of getting from here to there. The man saw him coming and said, "Can I help you?" "I'm sorry to interrupt," Marcus said, and he meant it. He was sorry to interrupt. It was genuinely inconvenient, and his voice communicated this plainly. "We've been trying to connect all week. I should have called ahead." He looked at the woman. "You ready?" There was a half-second where the whole thing could have gone differently. Then she picked up her purse and said, "Yeah, I'm ready." The man said something as they walked away. Marcus didn't turn around. Whatever it was, it had no weight. Outside on Penn Avenue, the air was cooler than the forecast had promised and smelled like rain coming from the west. They stood on the sidewalk, and the woman looked at him for a moment, and he looked back, and neither of them said anything, because there wasn't a script for this. "Thank you," she said finally. "You're all right. I'm fine. I've been fine. I just couldn't figure out how to." "Thank you." Marcus nodded. "You need me to wait with you until your ride comes?" No, I have my car." She paused, and there was something in her expression he couldn't read, not gratitude exactly, more like she was filing something away. "I'm sorry. I don't even know your name." "Marcus," he said. "Have a good night." He went back inside, settled his tab, and left a tip that was slightly too large, because he felt obscurely guilty for making Devon complicit in something without explaining it first. Then he drove home on the wet streets with the radio off, and when he got to Keswick Avenue, he sat in the driveway for a few minutes just breathing, and then he went inside and made coffee he didn't drink and went to bed and slept, for the first time in a while, without waking at 3 in the morning. In the morning he drove Lily to school, watched her run toward the double doors, with her orange backpack bouncing, and then he drove 20 minutes north to the Hartwell Group's corporate office on Bigelow Boulevard, where he had a 10 o'clock interview for a position he was qualified for and expected nothing from. The Hartwell Group provided fleet maintenance contracts to municipalities across western Pennsylvania, school districts, transit authorities, public works departments. Marcus had applied on a Tuesday night 3 weeks ago, half expecting the automated rejection to arrive before he'd finished his second cup of coffee the next morning. Instead, a woman named Sandra had called him and asked if he was available for an initial phone screen. The phone screen had gone well enough that she'd scheduled an in-person. He had pressed his gray shirt the night before. He had told Lily he had a meeting. She had said, "Is it important?" And he had said, "Probably not." And she had said, "Well, good luck anyway, Dad," which was such a Carol thing to say that he'd had to leave the room. The lobby of the Hartwell Group offices was the kind of lobby that communicated, without being aggressive about it, that this was a company that had been doing things a certain way for a long time. Dark wood, a reception desk with a woman behind it who had the practiced pleasantness of someone who had greeted 1,000 people in this room. Marcus gave his name and was told someone would be right with him, and he sat in one of the low chairs and looked at his hands. He thought about the rejection letter. He thought about the 3 before it. He thought about a conversation he'd had with his foreman, Dale, 18 months ago, when Marcus had asked about the path to a supervisory role, and Dale had scratched the back of his neck and said, "Honestly, Marcus, between us, the way these companies work now, they want to see a degree on paper. Doesn't matter what you know. They want to see it." Marcus had gone home and looked up part-time engineering programs and done the math on tuition and childcare and the number of hours in a day, and then he had closed the laptop and not opened it again for that purpose. He was not a person given to self-pity. Carol had not liked self-pity, and neither did Lily, and neither, if he was honest, did he. But there were moments when the arithmetic of his situation sat on his chest in a way that was hard to breathe around. "Mr. Hale?" He looked up. She was standing at the edge of the lobby in a dark blazer over a gray blouse, And for a full 3 seconds, the two of them simply looked at each other while the moment arranged itself into something neither of them had prepared for. It was the woman from Callahan's. He registered this in layers, the way you register an impact, first the fact of it, then the meaning of it, then the specific vertiginous understanding of what it meant for where he was currently sitting and why. She was looking at him with an expression that was doing the same thing in reverse, recognition first, then the context of recognition, then the adjustment required to proceed. "I'm Catherine Marsh," she said, and her voice was level. "I'm the Director of Operations here at Hartwell. I'll be conducting your interview this morning." Marcus stood. Marcus Hale. They shook hands. There was nothing in her grip or her expression that indicated anything other than a professional introduction between two people who had never met. And because she had set the register and the register was professional, Marcus matched it. He followed her down the hall. The conference room was small and quiet, a round table with 4 chairs, morning light coming in through a single window that faced the parking structure. She sat across from him and placed a folder on the table, and he noticed that his resume was in it, face up, the same single page he'd submitted online 3 weeks ago. No college listed, 16 years of experience. The certification from Allegheny County Vocational. She did not turn it face down. "Before we get into the standard questions," Catherine said, "I want to ask you something that's not on our usual list." She folded her hands. "Tell me about a time you saw something that was wrong, not your problem, not your responsibility, and had to decide whether to do anything about it." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He thought about the question the way he thought about a diagnostic problem. Not what's the answer they're looking for, but what is the actual answer. "I had a situation at a job site about 3 years ago," he said. "I was brought in to assess a transit authority's diesel fleet. Just a maintenance audit, 2-day job. On the second day, I noticed that one of their mechanics had been signing off on brake inspections that showed completion codes he couldn't have run. The machine that generates those codes had been offline for 6 weeks. I could see it in the maintenance logs." He paused. "That wasn't my contract. I was there for the engine assessment, not the brake records. What did you do?" "I flagged it to my contact at the authority and put it in writing in my report, Dal. Did that create complications for you?" The mechanic in question was the brother-in-law of the facilities director, so yes. He said it plainly, without drama. "I didn't get a follow-up contract from that authority." Catherine nodded slowly. She wrote something in the margin of a page he couldn't see. "And if you'd known in advance that flagging it would cost you the follow-up work, would you have done it differently?" Marcus thought about this as though it were genuinely worth thinking about. "No," he said. "The brakes were on buses carrying people. The calculation's not complicated." They continued for another 40 minutes. She asked about fleet management systems, about team communication across shifts, about a time he'd had to deliver bad news to a client. He answered everything the way he answered diagnostic questions, directly, with the specific details that were relevant, without flourishing things that didn't need to be flourished. Near the end, she closed her folder and looked at him in a way that was different from the way she'd been looking at him for the previous 40 minutes. "I want to ask you one more thing," she said, "and I want to be clear that this question is off the record and has no bearing on today's evaluation." She paused. "If you had known last night who I was, where I worked, that I was going to be sitting across from you this morning, would you have done what you did?" The room was very quiet. Marcus held her gaze the same way he'd held the eye of the man at Callahan's, not aggressively, not apologetically. "No," he said, and then corrected himself, because precision mattered. "I mean, I would have done the same thing. The knowing wouldn't have changed it." Why? He thought about it for a moment. About Lily with her orange backpack, about Carol at that Christmas party, about the buses and the brake records and all the small moments when the calculation was actually not that complicated if you didn't try to make it one. Because doing it for a reason other than the reason I did it would mean I was a different kind of person than I actually am, he said, and that person is less useful to everyone. Catherine looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her pen and made a note. She thanked him for his time and walked him to the lobby and shook his hand again. He drove home on Bigelow and picked up Lily's dry cleaning and 2 bags of groceries and a lottery ticket. He had no expectation of winning, and he put everything in its place in the kitchen and then stood at the counter and allowed himself for the first time, in longer than he could remember, to feel something that was adjacent to hope. Not certainty. He wasn't built for certainty about things he couldn't control, but hope. The specific, careful kind that doesn't make any promises but exists anyway. The way light exists through a window in a room you've been sitting in so long you stop noticing it. Until, one morning the angle changes and there it is. Sandra called 4 days later. On a Thursday morning, while Lily was eating her Pop-Tart and explaining to Marcus in careful detail why orange was a better color than yellow, his phone buzzed on the counter, and he looked at it, and he looked at Lily, who didn't stop talking, and he went into the hallway and answered. The position was his if he wanted it. Benefits started in 30 days. There was a company truck. He went back into the kitchen and sat down across from Lily, and she looked up at him and said, "Your face is doing a thing." "What kind of thing?" "A good thing." She bit her Pop-Tart. "Was it that interview?" "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, it was. I told you good luck." "You did," Marcus said. "You were right." He made himself another cup of coffee, and this time he drank it. Through the kitchen window, the morning was doing what mornings in Pittsburgh do in early October, showing off a little the sky, the specific shade of blue that only appears for about 3 weeks a year before the clouds come and stay until April. Lily finished her breakfast and took her plate to the sink without being asked, which she did occasionally and always as a surprise. He thought about what he would tell her someday. Not yet. She was 9, and 9 had its own concerns, most of them orange-colored. But someday, that the thing that had looked like a door closed, the degrees he hadn't gotten, the rejections that had piled up in his inbox like a record of everything the world had decided he wasn't, had not been the end of the calculation. That the calculation was longer than he'd been reading it. That character is not a credential anyone can print on paper, and no institution can grant or revoke. And that this turns out to matter in ways that the rejections hadn't predicted. He didn't know yet whether Catherine Marsh had hired him because of what she'd seen at Callahan's, or because of what she'd seen in that conference room. He suspected, knowing what he'd seen of her in both settings, that she would say it was the latter. He suspected she would be mostly right. The man at the bar and the man in the interview room were the same man, and she had hired the man, and what happened at Callahan's was only useful as evidence of something that was already true. The school bus horn sounded from the end of the block. Lily grabbed her orange backpack and said, "Bye, Dad," and he said, "Have a good day, Bug," and then he was alone in the kitchen with the blue October sky and the coffee, and the particular quiet of a house where something has just, quietly and without ceremony, gotten better. It wasn't a dramatic ending. There was no speech, no scene in a lobby, no moment with a soundtrack. There was just a man standing in his kitchen on a Thursday morning, knowing that next month he would drive a company truck to work and come home to his daughter and sleep without waking at 3, and that the tired he carried might, in time, become the kind that sleep could fix again. He washed his mug. He picked up his keys. He went to work.